the paper is flying through the machine. It's just huge speeds. And I saw the big paper rolls, bigger than a pickup truck, getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. There came the crane with that big new paper roll. How are they going to do that? How they do it, I still don't know. But I was just blown away by while the machine was running. They put the new paper in place, cut it off, glued it together. You wouldn't even see it. So those are brands you never hear about. But your newspapers are, your catalogs, and everything that's being made on those. So, cultural do's and don'ts. We don't have the time to go through the whole 9 yards of that. You'll learn a lot about that later. As I said earlier, Germans are accused of being very structured, very punctual, very focused on facts. And I agree with that. That's me. So you better schedule your business meetings well in advance, partially because people are extremely busy, partially because they have 6 weeks of vacation. Dress appropriately. You don't have to overdress, but don't come in jeans. That's not usual. Here in the US, you call everyone by first name and you. It's not that simple in Germany. There are different words to address different level of peoples. So I would never address my boss in Germany as John. It was Dr. Odendahl. When he came over here, because he was still my boss, what do I do? So we had a small conversation, and he said, okay, first name it's okay, but it's still C. And but in Germany, he was Dr. Odendahl. So there are different words for that. Now, you are not necessarily expected to understand all that, but never address, unless you're being asked, someone over there with the first name. Unless you're asked for your close friend. So it's Mr., Mrs., academic titles are being used. Meetings are very functional, well prepared. You are expected to come prepared. If you're not, it's an insult. Because you're wasting everybody's time. And if you want to sell something, come prepared with facts. It's not your personality, it's not your sales tactic, it's facts. If you don't have facts you can back up, the atmosphere will freeze, and you will walk out at the end of the meeting having accomplished nothing. I mentioned earlier, Germans are accused of not having fun. That's not true, but they have fun with their friends, their family. And the most important thing for you is just be yourself. Be polite. And if you don't know something, then just ask. You can make mistakes easily. I know I need to rush, but I want to give you an example of what happened to me when I came over here. And I thought I spoke English very well. They gave me my office, and pen and pencil and paper, and I like to write with pencil all the time. So I did something and needed an eraser. There wasn't one. So I walked up in the open office space, and there was a young girl, 17 years old, sitting there. And I walked to her and said, Karen, excuse me, please. Could I have a rubber, please? And at that moment, I realized I had done something. I just didn't know what. Because I saw her face, the color changing. And guess what? That's what English is the word for an eraser. So it means something different, I learned. So you have to expect things like this. And again, just ask. And if you make a mistake like this, just say, I'm sorry, I didn't know. And everybody will forgive you. Doing business in Germany is really not that challenging. It's not that difficult. The cultures in the US and in Germany are very similar. They're not as different as some cultures in Asia. As I already said, be prepared, don't waste anybody's time, and don't hesitate to ask. And if you're successful, there's a lot of good stuff. So, anybody knows what these two phrases mean? First is, how are you? And then, do you speak English? Okay. And you? Good. And the other one? The first one? Ihnen. Wie geht es Ihnen? That's one of those words for someone who's not close to you. Okay. Don't have time for questions, I understand.
Okay, our final speaker of the day. Thank you for your patience, and this is, I think you've gotten a lot of great information from these speakers. So our final speaker is Ellis Srinivasan, and he is native from India, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience. And I learned today that he's also an alum from Bellarmine, so he's got a great experience here as well.
Good afternoon. I know you've heard a lot of great things about Japan and Germany from these fine gentlemen. I'm going to talk to you about India quickly. My personal background, I go by LS. My full name is Lakshmi Raghavan Srinivasan. Try it, I'll write it out, give it to you. It takes a while, but you can get it, right? And make it simple and sweet, I just go by LS. I came here in 1991, been here for the last 20 years. Interestingly, I had no intentions of coming and settling in the United States. I was happily married to my wife. We were in India. I was a vice president for a company there, worked there for about 12 years. About 30, 31 when I came here. My wife had an opportunity to come and do her PhD here. And we said, okay, go finish your PhD, 5 years, come back, and then we'll continue living here. We'll visit each other. It so happened after the first year I get this call and say, you know what, I don't think this is going to work out. I was doing my MBA in India also part-time. She said, why don't you just quit, come here full-time? Do your MBA here, and then we can finish together and then go back. So that's not a bad idea. So I gave up, came here. Bellarmine was my home for 3 years. Literally lived here from morning 6 o'clock to 11 o'clock every day. I came here, worked here at the cafeteria to pay for my tuition, and then went to school in the evenings and went back home. Great, after 3 years, there was no going back. I don't think we ever even thought of going back to India after that. We made this home, and I have 2 children. They were born here, they go to school here. My daughter is getting ready to get into high school next year. So it's always a pleasure to talk to you folks and find out where's the best place for her to go. Having said that, my wife is a practicing lawyer here in the city. I work for a business consulting firm, which is a global firm. So I've had the opportunity to travel throughout the world. I've been all parts of Asia, most of Europe, and of course India. That's me in a nutshell. Coming to India, quickly, India is about 1/3 of US's landmass and 3 times the population. We are about right at the heels of China in terms of population, with about 1.2 billion people. We talked about density of cities and places. Think of Louisville, where you all live, and think about 7 million people living here. Right? That's the city I come from, Chennai. That's where I was born. Absolutely crowded. And with the globalization that has happened over the last 15 years, that city is getting even crowded. Quick, the economy, the Indian currency is called the rupee. It's about 45 rupees to $1, just to give you an idea. One of the fastest growing GDPs in the country today, India. India is, about 10 years back, was probably a third world country. 15 years back, no longer is. It's not even an emerging economy, it's an emerged economy. We are 9th in GDP, but from a purchasing power parity, we are number 4. There's still a high level of poverty in the country, but I guess with the globalization that is happening, that's slowly changing, and you can see the economy trickle down and really go down to the rural areas, which are now becoming part of bigger cities and feeling the impact of the globalization. Main industries, the biggest thing is software, and the next is automobile manufacturing over the last 10, 15 years. We always used to say that, Japan, America were really the forerunners during the Industrial Revolution. They really made their money when the Industrial Revolution took place, and countries like India was in the backseat, but that has turned around when it came to information technology revolution, and countries like India really took forward, and because of that today, the global economy, we are now in almost every part of the world, and every country in the world is now in India. So what has happened, and I was telling Bill before we came here, India is now a melting pot like what America was back in the 30s and 40s. You go to India about 15 years back to see a Caucasian face was a rarity. Today you go to India, you probably, it's like walking down a loop. It's that common. Quick top Indian companies. Some of these are private, some of these are government owned, but just from a revenue perspective, if you take a look, some of these you might not even hear, but Reliance Industries is by far the biggest. People know about them. They have petroleum, they have shipping, they have all kinds of there, and think of Reliance like the GE of this country. You have Tata Motors, part of the Tata Corporation, Tata Consultancy, which is an IT wing, which is one of the biggest software providers in the world. And Tata Motors is now emerging as one of the leading automobile manufacturers. For example, we own the brands like Jaguar and Land Rover now. Quick, India is a very diverse and culturally. We are talking about in the US, you get along with English. In India, we survive because of English. Because each state is so different. You just go across the border, I cannot understand what the person says. Very, very distinctly different languages, distinctly different culture, food, everything is different, but we are still a unified country. Go to the big cities, you'll see a lot of Western influence, and you'll hardly feel out of place if you go to any of the big cities. I'm going to talk quickly about a few cultural pointers, and this is very interesting. Be careful with your shoe, how you place your shoe, where you keep your shoe. I'll give you an example. A couple of things. I came here to the US, came here as a student. I was in my first class here in Bellarmine. I see students sitting with their legs propped up on the desk, and the lecturer is there talking. And I was like, oh my God, they just don't show any respect to him. And they were sitting and eating in class. It was like unheard of, right? You don't do these kind of things, but you're in a different culture, and it's okay. So that's another lesson that you have to learn is what is not okay here is probably okay somewhere else. So understand the culture where you're going. Staring, that's another thing I learned. Never stare here at someone else. It's okay there. In India, it's absolutely okay if you stare at me. It's absolutely okay to ask personal questions, right? First off the bat, you talk to somebody and say, hey, how old are you? Are you married? Right? And then you get to know them a little, you say, okay, how much money do you make? Predominantly, India is known to be a vegetarian country, which is not true. A lot of people eat meat, but one thing that you need to keep in mind, beef is something that is not acceptable. People do eat, but it's still not acceptable, right? Talking about business, very hierarchical. And again, this was very apparent to me when we came here. I was in school here. One of the things is you never question authority in India. And the first thing I saw here in school, in class, the lecturer is saying something, someone puts up a hand and says, I don't agree with you. I say that at school, next thing I'll be out of the door, not inside. And I learned it's okay not to agree. You can always agree to disagree, and it's absolutely fine. Learning comes from questioning, right? Where we came from, learning comes from listening and not questioning authority. So it's totally a different culture. You do expect to be micromanaged in India, in an environment where it's absolutely the opposite here. I give them a job, I expect them to do it. I'm looking at the end result, not on how they do it, which is very different here. Business meetings, unlike what Manfred was saying about Germany, they are very informal. They do get their business done, but they start with small chit chats, talking about social things, families, politics, before they get into the meat of the discussion. Giving gifts is acceptable, but what is not acceptable is not opening it in front of the person who gave it to you. Never open a gift in front of that person. You can talk politics, you can talk personal family, but one thing you have to be very sensitive about is talking about religion in India. There are many religions in India. Predominantly Hinduism is the biggest religion. Business tips. Indian organizations can be very hierarchical. Get to know how the hierarchy works, who the decision makers are. Don't spend a lot of time trying to please guys who are not going to make the decision. It doesn't work, right? Subsidiaries of foreign companies. If you take a look, India is no longer very secluded what it was in the 80s and 90s. You never had a foreign company there. In fact, Coca-Cola was kicked out and now they're back in. These companies tend to take the culture of the company within that country. So if you work for, let's say, Papa John's or Yum or Brown Forman or Sud Kenny, you can find the same culture that you find there within India. Of course, you've got to keep in mind that some of the cultural and country nuances come into that culture, but overall you can expect the same kind of stuff. Dealing with government officials, bureaucracy is at the height of it. Corruption is again rampant. The country is addressing it as fast as they can. They understand that it's one of its impediments to growth. But even today you'll hear a lot about corruption. Corruption, unfortunately, unlike corruption in advanced countries, which doesn't affect the normal day-to-day living of a person, in countries like India it does. So be mindful. We don't have a very strong sense of punctuality when it comes to social settings. You tell someone, hey, 7:30 for dinner, they might show up at 8:15, 8:30. And we always have this as a running joke. We say 7:30 and it is not IST. IST stands for Indian Standard Time, but IST also stands for Indian Stretchable Time. With that, if you do get to go to India, if you do get to interact, just be yourself, have fun, make mistakes. That's one thing we are okay with. We don't mind when people make mistakes. Butcher my name, I'm not going to get offended. But you'll learn ultimately. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. We're a little past our time, so I'm not going to make a lot of extra comments that I had already listed. I want to get you moving along.